Fun Ideas Productions presents the Fun Ideas Podcast.
We see the syphilitic shrinking obelisk, the white man's wilting dick. We see through dangling jowls of seedy game show trolls the smiling lie of the televised hive. The witches are watching with their thousand eyes. Witches are watching with their thousand eyes. We smell rotten teeth that speak beyond belief. A stick inside their skull would...
Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and welcome to Fun Ideas Podcast number 66. This episode is sponsored by the fine folks at Lee's Comics.
Hi, I'm George Takei. You know me as Helmsman Sulu on Star Trek. When I'm not busy going Warp Factor 8, I like to beam down to Lee's Comics and spend a lazy afternoon reading comics classics from Marvel to DC, from Dark Horse to Fantagraphics, and everything in between. So please, spend some time here at Lee's Comics and spend your hard-earned cash.
The Fun Ideas Podcast is made possible by listeners like you and from Lee's Comics of California, selling you what your mother threw out since 1982, online at leescomics.com. Headquartered, the timeline of the Monkey's solo years is out. Get it in paperback or hardback, and soon as an ebook on bearmanormedia.com or at Amazon. My co-author, Michael A. Ventrella, will be attending Beetlefest and selling and signing copies of it and our previous Monkey book there. He will be attending at the end of March. I'm doing the final edits for the TTV scrapbook, and I will be turning it in soon. I just got the assignment to do articles for Back Issue magazine on Hee Haw and on Sid and Marty Krofft. The Warren Kremer book proof is back, and now we're doing final edits. I'm still working on my own Light Up Your Life travel agency, and of course the Mad book, and a possible new Disney book. He's written numerous books about comic books and about Concord, North Carolina. He's also the editor of the long-running Back Issue magazine and the newer Retrofan magazine. Here he is, Michael Eury. On the phone today we have Michael Eury, who is editor of Back Issue and Retrofan. How are you today, sir?
I am doing fine, Mark. How about you?
I'm doing well. And as I usually start out, I usually ask, tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into comic books and becoming an editor of these publications and other books.
Well, I was lured into the world of comics by Adam West.
Wow.
Actually, my love of comics predated that. I'm 62 years old today. So, not today, but I've been 62 since my birthday, which was back in September.
Okay.
And so, I'm old enough to be first generation Batman baby of the mid-'60s. I was barely 8 years old when that show came on. And so I was the prime demographic for it. I mean, I got swept away by it and swept into the world of superheroes. But quite frankly, I had been reading comic books before that. My mom and dad were both readers of periodicals, and we made weekly trips to the newsstand when I was a child, and I continued that through adolescence and even actually ended up working at that newsstand after school in my high school years, and I was always straightening the comic book racks at that point. But
I thought you were going to say I was stealing the comic book. No, just kidding.
Oh, no, I don't think so. And so I just can't remember ever not having comics around. My parents bought them for me when I was a small child. At that time, the comics I would have been reading in the, say, early to mid 60s would have all been based upon the stuff I was watching on TV. So that would be Alvin and Casper, the Harvey stuff. So and I probably read an issue of Superman because I knew Superman from the reruns of the 50s TV show, which was still heavily into syndication in the 60s when I was a child. Right. But by the time Adam West, Burt Ward, and Batman came, and January 12th, 1966, that's a wonderful date. One of the prime dates in my personal calendar. I again was just sucked into that world. It was just mesmerizing. The color. I did not get the humor because it wasn't humorous to me back then. My parents would laugh, and that would just freak me out. I did not understand what was so funny about, say, Robin being held over a big frying pan or something. I thought that was pretty scary. And I did not. I went through my entire childhood and then even adolescence watching these reruns. I never noticed Cesar Romero's painted over Joker. I never noticed it until later, And it was actually in a book. I saw a picture, and it's like a young adult. I said, "Oh, wait a minute, that bristly thing that sticks right out," but never saw it as a kid. I bought into the fantasy of it all, so I started reading Batman comics. Mm-hmm. I literally remember calling my father as an 8-year-old and asking him to stop by the newsstand and bring me a Batman funny book, as we called them back then, and he brought Detective Comics number 350 home with him that night, and it was an issue that had, of all things, a Joe Kubert cover. Kubert didn't do a whole lot of Batman throughout his long and storied career, but he did the cover of this one. It was the Monarch of Menace. Did you remember that guy?
I think so, yeah. Isn't that the one with the puzzle on the cover, or no? Where you had to piece together or is that a different one? Maybe I'm thinking of
that was a different one. That was a different one. Yeah, this is a split cover. I do remember it was like a two-panel cover, two long vertical panels, and like a before and after thing. And the Monarch of Menace. I got tongue twisted on that. It was really like one of the lamest of Batman villains, and it is actually one that you almost would have expected to be on TV,
right?
Because it was just so lame. But that would have been a chance for, say, Bing Crosby to play a Batman villain if that had happened. But which they never did. Now I think back, they missed out with him. He would have been kind of interesting.
The crooner.
Yeah, but again,
anyway,
the crooner. I like that. A couple of years ago, I pitched a comic book series that did not get picked up anywhere, and it was set in the camp age. And one of this, I won't name this characters because maybe one of these days I will get a chance to do it. But one of his rogues gallery was Sinatra, which was essentially Frank Sinatra as Sinestro. I don't know. I can't say that without laughing. But long story short, and I've rambled on that answer. Batman lured me into Batman comics, and that was my gateway to DC. And so from Batman, that led me into The Brave and the Bold, which of course introduced me to all the other DC characters, and then Justice League, and then of course Robin led me to Teen Titans, and then before long, the Marvel characters were on TV, and then especially in '67 when the Spider-Man and Fantastic Four cartoons premiered, and at that point I got lured into those books, and so there you go. So, but more or less so, television still has largely been the eye through which I initially saw the world of superheroes. So I got into that and just read these things voraciously, and never stopped. I had a period or two where I might have tapered off a little bit, but then I was always, the siren call of comics called me back. And
you're like me.
And yeah, I know. So you've had a couple of times where you've actually tried to walk away, and
but I never did. Yeah. Other people have, but no, I never did.
I think I did when I was around 13, and there was that natural process. Back then, and at that point it was the early 70s. They still kind of existed in a world where the market share was still going for like 8 to 12-year-old boys, and I had just kind of aged out. And I might have read an Archie or two at that point, but then, Neil Adams was really coming about on Batman, and my younger brother, who was 8 years my junior, who had kind of been indoctrinated into reading comics, was like bringing a Batman comic or two in the house, and it had Neil Adams art, like the first Ra's al Ghul issue, and I saw that. I said, "Wow, this is some serious stuff." So I got sucked right back in. There I am again, and. Yeah, as far as getting into the industry, I was cartooning back in high school, drawing and writing my own comics, largely starring superheroes that were my classmates. And I would get into trouble because a comic book would get passed around class and some kid would be laughing. And then they'd see it, and it's got, my name on it and my handiwork. So I'm the one that goes to the principal office, even though I wasn't the one laughing in class. But, so the principal would smile and say, "You've got some talent, but just make sure that you don't pass these things around in class." "Yes, sir." And then until the next time it happened. But, but I ended up, growing up in North Carolina, there really wasn't a clear career path back in the 70s for a guy who wanted to work in the comic book business like I did. And back then everything was headquartered in New York, which might have well been Mars to a kid in small town North Carolina. So I followed the siren call of my other love, which was music, and I was a trombone player and got a music degree in college and became a band director very shortly, and I hated it. Yeah. It just wasn't for me. It just wasn't for me, and I realized pretty bad that my heart, soon that my heart wasn't into teaching. And so stumbled for years until I found my way into the comic book industry, starting by writing for fanzines like Amazing Heroes, and then finally doing some stuff. I know your passion and your historical knowledge for animated properties, and the first few gigs I had writing for comics were for animated properties. The first couple were unpublished. Spotlight Comics, you remember Spotlight?
Yeah, they did a couple Underdogs or something like that.
Yeah. I wrote one Mighty Mouse story. Okay. They did a straight Mighty Mouse comic, but then they were doing another one that was going to be based on the Ralph Bakshi cartoon of that era, and I wrote a story featuring the cow, which is a great villain. Right. Yeah, and it was got approved by Ralph Bakshi, but they did not publish that issue, and upon the merit of that, the editor Jim Main had me write an Underdog story, and I loved Underdog, and that wasn't published, and so they weren't around for long, as you recall. Right. Yeah, were you reading those back in the day?
Yeah, I got everything that I could find back then. I'm still that way now, but it's like American mythology kind of has grabbed all those characters, so I try to get as many of those as I can nowadays. So.
Yeah, and they're doing a good job with that. I wish Underdog were published a little more frequently. But
that's my only reservation about them, is that they kind of have sporadic and erratic publishing schedules on all their characters, and it's hard to find them all, and things like that. But I get them if I can.
But still, overall, I think in 2020 we're lucky that you can still get an Underdog comic book.
True.
Even if you only get one every 9 months or so, that's still better than none at all. But the actual first comic book story that bore my credit was, I guess, when it came out in '87. It was Peter Porker, the Spectacular Spider-Ham. But it wasn't in Spider-Ham's own comic. By that point, the Star Comics line and everything for Marvel had gone away, but Peter Porker was popular enough for them to keep him alive as a backup series in Marvel Tales. Right. Yeah, so I wrote a handful of those, and I am very proud to say that I created the Pun Fisher. Which was, 87, 88, right? And at that point, I'm also an editor at Comico, the comic company in Norristown, Pennsylvania, and I found my way up there to the Philadelphia region for that job. And I was still writing some Spider-Ham stories, and the Punisher is really hot in the late '80s and mid to late '80s, and so I asked Jim Salicrup, the editor of Marvel Tales, I said, could I do a takeoff of the Punisher as long as it didn't kill anybody? He said, sure. So Alan Kupperberg, the late Alan Kupperberg, was the artist, and I said, let's just do Charlie the Tuna and dress him up like the Punisher. And, he shot scallops and electric eels out of his guns, so I mean, nothing was lethal. But what fun that was, so my roots were in that stuff, and I still love it and wouldn't mind returning to some of that. One of these days, I wrote the cartoon version of The Mask when I was at Dark Horse Comics.
Yeah, remember that?
Yeah, but again, how I got into editing these magazines, I mean, I wanted to, I never was a good enough artist to really be a professional artist, and editing just seemed to be a way to, in 1987, I remember my wife telling me I was trying to be an artist and a writer and a journalist, and I was also wanting to be on Saturday Night Live, and I was in a comedy troupe and all that stuff. Yeah, I know. And she said, honey, you need to just focus on one thing. And so there were a couple of assistant editorial jobs that I knew were open because I had started to make some contacts with people in the industry through Amazing Heroes when I was writing for them, and inquired simultaneously to Comico and to DC. And DC had just hired Renee Witterstatter to be Mike Carlin's assistant, but I kind of got in the loop for the next hiring phase there. And but Diana Schutz at Comico called me, and she said, your letter had no grammatical or punctuation mistakes, so I'd like to call you in for an interview. And I went in, and in a couple of weeks I was there.
Cool.
As an assistant editor, so that was pretty cool, and I learned a great deal from her. She was amazing.
Now, how did you get involved from that point to getting involved with Tomorrow's and all their publications?
Well, let's see, I spent a couple of years at Comico, a few years at DC, and then went out west to Portland, Oregon for Dark Horse Comics, and was a group editor out there. And so I logged, for a better part of a decade or so, editing at 3 companies, one of them major. And then a couple of factors, including an adult onset hearing loss that was I really hadn't dealt with back then, largely in a state of denial and some degree of depression about it. These factors started to come into play too, and started to make it more difficult for me to do the traditional desk job because I wasn't hearing normally. I was missing things, misinterpreting things because my hearing was wrong. And again, when you have a hearing loss, you can get some help and amplification. Hearing aids do not restore your hearing to what would be normal, but they improve it. And and plus I needed some kind of attitudinal adjustment because I was really down in the dumps over my hearing loss in particular. But I sort of walked it out of comics in the early 2000s. And at that point, going back to the funny animal stuff, I was still, I'd been writing in the mid-90s Adventures of the Mask for Dark Horse, which was based on the animated version of The Mask. And then I was doing a lot of Looney Tunes stories for DC, actually for Warner Brothers Worldwide Publishing, which publishes it through DC, and did Dole, Pinky and the Brain, and I even wrote some Flintstones for Archie Comics when they had that license, and did a Mr. Magoo story too. But by the time the early 2000s came around, I was just I just was not getting much work, and kind of aged out of the comics mainstream, and was working a job as a communications director at a small organization in Oregon, and just kind of was creatively unfulfilled, and wrote a book at the request of a friend, or suggestion of a friend. That was a history of Captain Action, which was a beloved toy of mine as a child, the original superhero action figure. Excuse me. And it was going to be published by a different company from the person who encouraged me to write the book, but he could not publish it. And then it sort of sat there, and of course it kind of soured me again. I said, well, great, I thought I kind of had a new door reopen for me to get back into the fold. But then Tom Stewart, who is a friend and creative person who lives in Seattle, and I at that point had not met him, but knew him through the miracle of the internet, which was sort of burgeoning at that time in the late 90s. He said, you ought to contact Two Morrows and see if John Morrow would like to publish it. And I did, and he did.
Yes.
And so John published that, and his wife Pam designed it, and that was a really good effort. It was a great book. It was a slow seller, but a consistent seller, and it just got, I'm proud to say, great feedback, and that was wonderful. And so I had this relationship, and so I asked John, seeing that at that point, and now we're in the 2003, around there, 2002, 2003, the early 2000s. Asked John Morrow, what do you think about a book about my former boss at DC Comics, Dick Giordano? Because one thing I didn't mention earlier is, yes, I was an editor at DC, but for a year I was Dick Giordano's assistant, so I worked in management with him, and just formed a close bond with him, and he became a mentor and a friend, and so John said, sure, that would be a great book. So I flew from Oregon. My wife came along with me because she was friends with Dick too from back in those days, and we flew down to Florida where Dick had retired and spent a week with him and interviewed him and got to go through his archives, and it was just a wonderful process. I went back and wrote that book, and so then Two Morrows had been publishing John B. Cook's comic book Artist.
Right.
And John had taken that to a different publisher, Top Shelf, and there was a vacancy on John Morrow's publishing calendar for a comics journal, and he had the title Back Issue in mind, and a couple of the features therein, Rough Stuff, the pencil art showcase, and Greatest Stories Never Told. And he contacted me. He said, we've had a good relationship with these two books, and he said, you're always on time and do good work. And he said, would you consider this? And I said, yeah. So we started that in late 2003, and here we are, in 2020.
Yes.
And I mean, man, wow. I feel blessed. I really feel blessed that the magazine is still going strong. We won an Eisner Award last year. That's just wonderful. I mean, it's in my office, but it's a show. Sorry. I don't know if you heard a beep there.
Yeah, I heard a little beep. That's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. But that Eisner was just fabulous, and we've been nominated 2 other times.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. I was going to say, was it nominated before? I thought it was, because I've been writing for a long time for it myself. But
I mean, I really try not to focus on that stuff. To me, that's gravy. My award, and it sounds cliched, but it's true. My reward is just to be able to work on this magazine, to get these oral histories and then these nostalgic studies, the stuff that I grew up with, that the readers grew up with. But it's not just stoking the fires and flames of nostalgia. It's looking at the material, and you do this with your wonderful source books on animation and pop culture too. It's looking at this material through the lens of adult wisdom and intellectual curiosity.
Right.
You're getting the stories behind the stories. So, yes, making you feel like that 8-year-old you were when you watched that first Underdog cartoon, but you're also learning about those people who created it, and a lot of these guys were essentially, and I'm obviously preaching to the choir with you, but for anybody who would be listening to this, they probably know this too, but they were unsung during their careers.
Right.
There weren't a lot of mechanisms out there that would celebrate their work, and give them a pat on the back.
Right.
And especially a lot of these comic book artists of the 50s, 60s, 70s, they were just workhorses, and they weren't rock stars like guys get to be today. But so to get their stories in print and for posterity is a great honor. So that to me has just sort of been the honor of doing the magazine and being able to do it. I mean, come on, I work from home. I'm dictated by deadlines, but I still make my own schedule. Mm-hmm. So, if I need to have a flexible time, I've got it. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's a blessing. That's wonderful. A lot of people don't have that. A lot of people couldn't manage it either because in the past, as a comic book editor, I had a hard time managing some artists who some were very disciplined and wonderful and did the job. Others would not quite get it because the artiste sides of them did not jive with production schedules. Mm-hmm. And they would wait for the muse to strike to sit down and draw, or and oftentimes creative souls are tortured souls, and they're you never feel like you're good enough, or you have to spend 2 weeks on one page when you've got to deliver 22 pages in 1 month. So right. it's difficult to produce a regular series. So that's a discipline. So mm-hmm. and so I am disciplined with my work, even though I just embrace the flexibility of having a freelance, creative artist lifestyle. I feel very fortunate to have that. But Eisner was just sort of a nice feather in the cap of all of this, because again, I just enjoy the magazine, and every now and then there's a theme that I approach which might not have been my bread and butter. Like right now, I'm working on one that's commemorating. Will be Back Issue number 121, which will come out, I believe, in July.
That's what I was going to ask, too. How many issues? I know there's over 100, but I forget where we're at.
Issue 119 comes out in March.
Okay.
So, and right now I'm already planning up to like 129, 130.
Oh, wow.
And and I, sort of like the, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, like the wonderful Wizard of Oz. I've got all these plans, and I plan ahead. I don't let my writers, yourself included, know about what's coming down the pike until it's at a point when I know I can manage a dialogue, because I just can't really get into, I don't have the time to get into creative, discussions about something that's going to be published 2 years from now, even though I kind of know 2 years from now we're going to do this.
Right.
So it's just a time management thing, quite frankly. And if I started, and I'm also, even though I'm a professional and a grown man, I'm still a kid at heart, and so sometimes it's easy to get distracted by that shiny thing. So if I know 2 years from now I'm going to do an issue based on something I absolutely adore, I still have to think, Michael, you got to wait, and you will get there. Or if you want to work on it quietly in your free time, do it, but don't work on that thing 2 years from now, because it really strikes that chord with you when you've got all these other things in front of you that are going to be published more immediately. So it's just you've been doing this for a while. I know you manage a number of things. You just have to discipline yourself,
right?
And you know what your goalpost is. That's the deadline. And you just get it done. And when the deadline deadline comes, you turn it in.
Right.
And then you're on to the next one, and that's the nature of the job. And it's just, it's interesting because there have been some people who are just vastly much more talented than I, who probably have stumbled and not really been able to maintain a toehold in the comics or creative arts businesses because of the difficulty and just the discipline of it, and keeping the trains on time.
Right.
Even if you're an artist, you got to keep the pages flowing, or else you don't work. And unless you're just an absolute superstar who can get paid very handsomely for doing a portrait of this or that, and some people can, and that's wonderful for them.
Right.
But not me. I've got to keep cranking. So I got to keep working.
Well,
I love it. I mean.
On my end, I was going to say, I do the research and everything. It's harder for me sometimes, but it's a challenge, if it's a topic that I don't normally talk about. Like, this one was way back, but I did one on not Atomic Mouse, what am I talking about? Astro Boy. And I think you assigned that one to me way back when. And I knew a little bit about Astro Boy, but I never read any of the comics, and I had seen the cartoons 100 years ago, and it's like, oh, geez, this is going to be tough. But I didn't let it show, and I did my research, and I got the interviews and everything, so I still will pull it off. Unless, it's never been a case where, Michael, I can't do it. Give it to somebody else. I don't want to do that unless absolutely necessary. I don't think I've ever had a case like that, but that one was a tough one. But I'm curious. So I do this research, or I have the article written and I turn it in. What is the step-by-step that you do afterwards, without revealing topics and everything? But, it seems like you're very well planned ahead. So, take us through Back Issue or Retrofan, just how you plan an issue and what you do.
Well, they're different for each of the two magazines. So let's start with Back Issue, since we've been talking about that one.
Okay.
Each issue of Back Issue is thematically structured. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, the issue that I'm working on right now, we're proofreading it. It's been designed. Is issue 121, Conan and the Barbarians, as a theme, and it's commemorating the 50th anniversary of Marvel's publication of Conan #1 by Roy Thomas and Barry Smith, now Barry Windsor Smith. Right. And so that was just a subject matter that, I read some of those, but I never was really a big fan, but I still learn. This is the cool thing about the magazine, too. There are enough writers, I'm fortunate there, too, like people like you. I've got some 60, 70 writers in our overall pool, and usually we're going to find at least one guy out there, or gal, who is passionate about a subject. Every now and then I say, I want to put so-and-so in the magazine, there's tumbleweeds are rolling on, and you hear the crickets chirping, nobody knows about it, and that's a challenge because I still want to ultimately cover everything. Literally, I want to cover every single comic that was published in the Bronze Age. We will eventually get there if we can. And but anyway, the way an issue rolls around is I will come up with a theme, or someone will suggest a theme. And what I tend to do now, and over time I've taken a little stronger editorial reins with this, but I often will look at our timeline, which is essentially the Bronze Age and beyond. So I still like to anchor it in the 70s, 80s, and now we kind of are inching more into the early to mid 90s, because that really is kind of far back now, too. It's certainly not recent like it was 17, 18 years ago when we started the magazine. But after the theme is chosen, then I go through the index and I do have kind of a loose index and flip through some past issues to just refresh myself with what we've already done, so we don't repeat ourselves. And then generally we'll offer to the writing pool the chance to propose articles or throw out pitches for the different topics that generally I offer there. Sometimes they come into me over the transom or through dialogues with writers. And every now and then there is a topic that I know I want to cover where there's a go-to writer. I mean, case in point, with you, an Underdog, we're going to do an issue for 2021 that's, based on, TV Toon characters. And I didn't even consider opening the floor for Underdog. I just knew that you were perfect for that, and unfortunately, I emailed you and you said yes. So boom, there we go. That one's locked in. So that's how sometimes when you get these messages, and if anybody else listening to this is one of the back issue writers, they see the emails. They're sent out just to the email writing staff or pool, and it says, the theme of back issue 123 is superhero romance. And so I'll have a couple of things already there that may be assigned due to previous discussions or whatever. I mean, occasionally I've had these really passionate appeals from writers. I really want to do this, and the reason I'm the best for it is because I have known this creator for 20 years, whatever. And every now and then that sways me. Yeah, okay, yeah, you've got the inside track. You can do it.
Right. Okay.
But I open up the floor for the pitches from the writers, and they send in their proposals, and then I, basically I read them all and try to consider who's going to be the best fit for that. And then I make the assignments, and we move on to the next issue, and so I manage it that way. And really, with each issue, too, even though there is a theme, I try not to let it be too heavy in one direction. Every now and then, though, there's a theme that is just so exclusive that it kind of exclusive. Let me rephrase that. I'm getting tongue twisted here. A theme that will just exclude the inclusion of something that's not firmly anchored to the theme itself. And that would be in the case of, say, issue 119 is Guardians of the Galaxy. I briefly toyed with the idea of throwing in a Guardians of the Universe article into that, just to throw a little DC content in there and not make it all Marvel specific. But the Guardians of the Galaxy issue was actually presented to me by a fellow who's just done a wonderful amount of work and interviewing like everybody who's produced a Guardians comic going back to the early days through the Jim Valentino series of the 90s, and then more contemporary work with, say, Keith Giffen. And so I have these 3 sections: Bronze Age, Copper Age, and Modern Age of Guardians of the Galaxy interviews that he provided, and sandwiched in between them are histories of Rocket Raccoon and Star-Lord, both characters who started, independent of the Guardians and actually had, kind of a healthy amount of stories published about them in the Bronze Age of comics. So, with each issue, though, essentially, again, the writers get a chance to make their pitches, and I already have some material I want to see there, and I just keep that process moving forward. We're now into like the 18th year of production of this magazine, and I still have a folder full of ideas for future themes, and they get suggested to me on the Facebook page, and every now and then one of the writers will say, well, have you ever thought of a so-and-so issue? And wow, no. And when people do suggest that, I also give them credit inside the magazine and have a copy sent them as a thank you for their creativity and their participation. Now, Retrofan is a whole different story. We haven't mentioned it other than just by name in this conversation, but Retrofan is essentially a magazine that is now in its second year, actually now in its third year, and we premiered, in mid 2018.
I think issue 7 was the last one I saw. I don't know. Issue 7? Yeah, I don't know.
Issue 8's now coming out.
Oh, okay.
This one in a couple of weeks, yeah. And now we're bi-monthly, so there'll be more
Okay.
fans. But our mandate here is to celebrate the crazy cool culture you grew up with, which is mainly 60s, 70s, 80s, although now I'm starting to flirt a little bit with the 50s, too, because there's some iconic stuff there, like The Adventures of Superman and Sheena, that also had legs in later generations. I said legs and Sheena in the same sentence. But anyway, and the content is largely dictated by my editorial discussions with my columnist, because there are 6 regular columnists there, myself included, in the number, who sort of have their departments. Andy Mangels does Retro Saturday Morning, and Scott Saavedra, who is also the designer, does his Secret Sanctum, which he covers all kinds of stuff. You never know what he'll cover. I mean, he did one on letters that his dad made him write to celebrities when he was a kid. And so from Neil Armstrong, and Jack Kirby. I mean, come on. I mean, what fun stuff. And we have Ernie Farino. He's an Emmy-winning, sci-fi and effects director, and he often handles monsters and sci-fi, but every now and then he'll steer into other directions. He wrote this great behind-the-scene piece on the Dick Van Dyke Show in issue 7. Yeah, that was wonderful, and he actually provided some behind-the-scene photographs in color. I mean, come on, that was weird. That was really weird to see what the Petrie's living room looked like in color. That was just. I mean, it's like you're on Earth 2 or something, Scott Shaw does his Oddball World, and who am I forgetting? I'm embarrassed now.
Sean Clancy said he's done stuff for it. Sean Clancy?
Sean's done some interviews. He's not one of the regular columnists, but I have enough for people, and I knew that one day you will rotate into this magazine. We'll find the right topic for you. Will Murray.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Will Murray. He likes to really research the origins of pulp and comics characters as well, and he's, of course, very well versed at that as a historian. Also, he writes a lot of these characters in novels, but he also does TV shows, too. I mean, he's done for the next issue to come out, issue 8, the new issue. He did a great piece on Honey West.
Oh, wow.
Which, I mean, that one-season show with Anne Francis of 66 to 67, which is really kind of trailblazing. A female private eye, and it actually did pretty well in the ratings, but it turns out that ABC ended up opting for bringing over the British import, The Avengers, and so Diana Rigg, the delightful and wonderful Diana Rigg, sort of out Honey West on the air on ABC. But, so we get to cover all this other stuff outside of comics, although we flirt with comics a little bit in Retrofan. And that one is times a little more of a challenge to put together, just because of deadlines and such. But, every issue we still come out on time. I'm thankful that things move along smoothly, and I'm learning so much there, and I get to interview and meet people too. I'm working on I've established a relationship with a wonderful gentleman named Martin Grams Jr.
Oh, I know him.
Do you know?
Yep.
He runs the Mid-Atlantic Nostalgia Show in the Baltimore area in mid to late September each year. And we were there last year with Retrofan and Tomorrows, and I got to interview Jerry Rachel, who played Fake Jan, in the Brady Bunch Variety Hour, and she's wonderful, and she and I hit it off. Great interview. So there's a Fake Jan Brady interview coming up in Retrofan, and Retrofan was just a big hit there, and so through Martin, we've kind of formed this relationship, and we're just doing kind of cooperative ventures, and I'm getting more of an opportunity now to work with them to get access to some of the celebrities there for interviews for retro fans. So I can't name any specifics at this point, but there are a number of people who will be coming to the shows that will also be appearing in retro fan interviews, and I'm excited about that. And one of them, I've been speaking with this person's publicist over this week, and if it does happen, it's going to be a great interview and a great cover, and one that will excite a lot of people who grew up in the 60s and 70s. It's somebody that they absolutely love, and you notice that I went through this and did not even mention a gender, so I'll just let you try to figure that out who it is, but I really hope it happens. But,
now, do you get time to, with doing 2 magazines, and now you said Retrofan going bi-monthly, do you still have time to do books? I mean, you did like Hero a Go-Go, which I think is kind of like the precursor to Retrofan in a certain respect. But do you have time to do anything else, or it's just the magazines now?
Well, right now it's mainly the magazines. Hero Go-Go was my last book, and it was sort of a precursor to Retrofan. Retrofan magazine itself was an idea that had been in mind, although not with that name. It was just sort of had the blanket working title of Retro Magazine. And it's something I wanted to do going as far back as 2012. But it was just a matter of timing. It wasn't quite right back then for a couple of reasons. And after doing Hero a Go-Go, after spending a year of immersion into rereading those old campy comic books and watching Space Ghost and Hercules, cartoons of Mighty Hercules and Captain Nice and then listening to the Monkees and the Cowsills and the Beatles and watching Lost in Space and all this other stuff, it primed me for Retrofan. And Scott Saavedra was the designer of Hero a Go-Go, and he and I just formed a great relationship. And I remember after he delivered the layouts of Hero a Go-Go, I said, Scott, man, thank you for bringing my childhood to life. He said, what do you mean your childhood is my childhood too, man? And so he gets it, and so that's kind of the attitude we have with Retrofan. We're just loving it, but it's more than nostalgia. I mean, people just dig up all this trivia and behind-the-scenes stuff. So the challenge I have there, though, is it's a little more general audience skewed than Back Issue. I can afford to be a little more niche, oriented in Back Issue and go into some of the realm of the true fanboy or the true OCD collector. Whereas with Retrofan, I still have to remember that, yes, we are distributed on the newsstand at Barnes & Noble, and now I hear we're making it into some Books A Million, so that's good, because we are finding some readers that way. Yeah. And that's great. It's riskier because we have to produce more copies that generally get returned. But, Tomorrow's is aggressive with its online sales, and so, they keep moving those copies. But as far as having time to do other books, there's one in mind that I've been wanting to do, and I just haven't found the time to do it. It's sort of a tonal shift from Hero a Go-Go, but it would cover the next big movement in comics, which was the relevance movement of the late 60s through the early 70s, which is something I'm just totally passionate about, because that's what really kind of rekindled my love of comics and got me really anchored into becoming a fan, because, I mean, if the camp comics were my childhood, then the relevant comics where the Justice League was fighting pollution, and Teen Titans and Spider-Man were in campus sit-ins, that kind of thing. That was and Green Lantern, Green Arrow. Come on, man, that was the stuff of my adolescence, and that's what kind of shaped my social conscience. So I really want to do a book on that stuff, but I really kind of haven't had time, and I've sort of reached this zone where I'm 62, like I said at the beginning of the conversation. I don't want to work this hard. I'm not painting myself as a picture of me being lazy, but I just don't want to work all the time anymore.
Well, I get it. I mean, after a few books, you're like, okay, I have a few books now. I don't need to do it anymore.
Yeah, it's tiring. You know what it's like. You've got a ton of research to do.
Yeah.
You've got all the interviews, the transcriptions, or even if somebody else does a transcription for you, then you have to clean it up and then do the editing and as you know, producing a book isn't just taking all this stuff and just stitching it together. There really needs to be a narrative for it to be a compelling book. Now, unless you're doing an encyclopedia, and then that's a different story. Because your encyclopedia, you've got your structure, whether it's alphabetical or chapter-driven, whatever. But still, even if you're looking at it like Hero a Go-Go, there's like a chapter on this, a chapter on that. Even when I did Comics Gone Ape, I mean, come on, that's that was
which I helped with too.
But there you go. But still, a chapter on Jungle Comics, a chapter on future monkey supervillains. I mean, but still, there's kind of a narrative there that threads it all together, and so you really kind of have to have that, I think, for these books to really sort of hold up, and that takes just a lot of work, and I'm just not working as many hours as I used to. Right. I'm certainly not retired, but I will gleefully admit that I'm in a bit of a stage of semi-retirement. I work a solid, not quite full-time day, and I still would like to write, though, and I wouldn't mind writing some comics and other creative projects again. And I talk about it, to my wife, and she probably rolls her eyes and say, "Well, then do it." But then again, if I did it, then she and I wouldn't be playing Scrabble or taking those walks along the river like we do now. So I just feel that if it's intended to be, it'll happen in its natural course. And then but I probably do have a couple more books in me, but they're not going to happen overnight.
I will say this, and I don't think you even know this, is like I mentioned that I helped out, as it were, on the Comics Gone Ape. I have to admit, when I got a copy of it in the mail and you said thank you, I was like, what did I do on that? And then I saw the cast for King Kong cover, and I go, oh, okay, it was something to do with that, I'm sure. But it was one of those ones where, wow, I didn't even, so I was kind of half joking where I was like, I helped out on that one. I helped more out on the Hero Go-Go. I know you did ask me a few questions, and I think I contributed a few facts and pictures and stuff like that, so I'm happy about that.
And you did. I appreciate that, too, and that illustrates, too, is I really do try to, as you know, these projects are team efforts. Right. And when you do yours and when I do mine, I mean, we're the guys with our names on the spine, I guess, of the book, and on the byline, and as the author or, editor, you're sort of the captain. But it is a team, and I always do my best to give credit where credit is due, and send a comp or have a comp sent to people, because it's I think if it were solely resting on the laurels of one individual, it would that's like an Atlas type shrug fest. That would be really difficult to do, because and most people, as you know, as you have been, and I know that I contributed a quote or two to your Cracked book. This is, we're all here to help each other out and just to make sure that all this material is archived, and I just hope that when we're all gone, that somebody's going to care. I really do. I'm happy that we're leaving these archives behind of this work, but I just, I don't know, as the world changes, are there going to be people in the future who are going to be curious about, Adam West as Batman and Mighty Mouse? I hope so.
Well,
I really hope so.
It was Andy Mangels, who I interviewed a few podcasts ago, and he said, if if we don't get it down, nobody's going to get it down, and it's like, well, that's true, and so, we just have to hope for the best that some future researcher will go back. It's like, what were they talking about in the late 20th century, early 21st century about this stuff, It's like, oh, there's like real details here. We don't have to guess, as to why there was, using your story idea, why there was social consciousness in comic books in the late 60s. It's all laid out here by Michael Eury in his book, whatever.
That's really true. Andy's right, and you're absolutely right about that. Yes, and it's important for us to leave this body of work behind. I think that just because of everyone's dependence upon social media, that has bred a culture of laziness, and I've been guilty of this too. It's easier just to Google something and then get your answer, and then okay, the week that today you and I are talking here in February, and this past week has been dizzying as far as political news is concerned, because we've had the acquittal of President Trump at the conclusion of the impeachment trials. We've had the State of the Union. We've had the very divisive reactions to that. We've had the president's reactions to his acquittal. And we've had the Iowa caucuses and the just the fiasco that the tabulations have been regarding the vote, and it's just been all over the place. But in a way, to me, on this Sunday, after all of this that we're speaking, it feels like the impeachment was about a month ago,
right?
And the State of the Union was, about 3 months ago, and it's only a matter of days.
Right.
So my point is, we've all got very short attention spans today, and stuff happens so quickly, and social media gives us this tremendous immediacy where I think everybody is just primed for instant gratification. Okay, got that solved, move on to the next thing. So it is very easy to fall prey to underinformation and misinformation,
right,
no matter how well-intentioned you are. And so when you're seeking out something and you get that quick answer, then okay, that's fine. And what happens today is people who are well-intentioned will make all these posts and write these blogs, and I've done it a couple of times too. I've shared incorrect information because I found it and it seemed to be credible, and then you share it, and then later you realize that it was wrong.
Yeah.
And so at least you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
At least with Back Issue and Retrofan, I'm fortunate enough to be published regularly and have a forum, at least in the letters columns or an editorial, where I can apologize and then correct the record.
Right.
But there's just so much stuff that just gets posted that then gets shared and then gets believed,
right,
and now even politically we're bombarded by misinformation, and there are and I'm going to try to say what I'm about to say without casting any aspersions on either party, but there's misinformation from the left, misinformation from the right. There is stuff that's created out there to keep Americans arguing constantly, and we can't agree on anything, and we like to blame it on Congress, but man, it's the average person. I mean, come on. What kind of battles have we seen over even Marvel and DC movies in recent years? I mean, and people hate each other over this stuff, and I just don't get that.
Right.
I mean, we are lucky to live in a day to be able to choose between 6 or 7 different superhero TV shows, and to have all this stuff in the movie theater, and the fact that people hate each other over this and that, I don't get that. I don't get that. I wish our culture could lighten up a little bit about that and just be thankful that we've got all this stuff. You don't have to love it all,
right,
but just because somebody doesn't like it doesn't mean that they hate you. The identity politics and identity entertainment culture, where if you don't love or what I love or think the way I think politically, then you've insulted me. That to me is crazy.
Yeah.
That is just, we need to stop that and not take that kind of stuff so personally, because the real important stuff is not getting solved.
Right.
People aren't getting educated. People aren't getting opportunities. Our infrastructure is crumbling because we keep going on and on about this or that, or Game of Thrones versus this or that. I mean, it's just like, come on, people. Let's just calm down and appreciate all the good stuff we've got and stop fighting.
Yeah. It will change. I can't guarantee it will be for the better, but it will change. So this is temporary, so whatever it is, but I get what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But had a couple questions here. Now that, I just wanted to mention some other books you've done since, we're talking about your career and everything like that. So you've done some of those companion books. So you did a Krypton companion, a Batcave companion, and a supervillain book. I don't know if that said companion on the title. Is that all your books, plus the Dick Giordano and Hero and all that?
I did the Justice League companion too.
Yeah, I said that one. Yeah,
and the supervillain book was the sequel to the superhero book. It was an encyclopedia, A to Z, and that was for a publisher called Visible Ink Press.
Oh, okay.
Probably best known for the Movie Hound companion. Did I get the name right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
And those have been in print for a while, and they still produce those. Although, the superhero book came out first, and I was one of the contributing writers, as was Andy Mangels.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had a good relationship with the editor of that, and she and I partnered to edit co-edit the supervillain book, and I was one of the contributing writers of that as well. So let's see. Then Captain Action has had 2 printings, a revised second edition. Batcave Krypton. I'm looking across the shelf right now at them, so I'm within eye shot. Hero a Go-Go being the last one.
Yeah.
I've done 4 regional history books.
I was going to ask you about that because I saw some books about Concord. Is that you?
Uh-huh.
Is that you?
That's me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, actually, in the case of North Carolina, it's actually pronounced Concord.
Concord, okay.
Concord, right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But that's my hometown, Concord, North Carolina.
Okay.
And after having lived in Portland, Oregon for 14 years, initially drawn out there by Dark Horse Comics, in 2007, my wife and I moved back to our mutual native state, North Carolina, and we ended up in my hometown of Concord, although we don't live there now. We lived in Hurricane Alley on the coast in a beautiful town called New Bern, North Carolina. And it's the colonial capital, so there's a lot of history here, and this is just a gorgeous city at 2 rivers. But for 4 years, when living in Concord, I was the executive director of the nonprofit organization that was a history organization. So I got to preserve the history, which was really an extension of what I had started to do at that point. This was 2008 through 2012, so I already had 5 years of Back Issue under my belt at that point. And so I was thinking, and I actually used this when I applied for the job. I said, I've been chronicling comic book history and popular culture history, and I can do it with this too. And I've got this publication record, and so I got this job, and it was part-time, and I still did that with Back Issue and wrote the books. And in 2012, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, that's even when I was considering starting Retrofan, but at that point, let's see, I was editing Back Issue. I was the executive director of the history organization. I was the curator and director of 2 small museums in town. I was writing these history books for Arcadia Publishing, which are largely books that are photo-driven, but I had to dig up the photos and get the stories and collect the material and write the captions and write the chapters and all that. And I was still writing the history books like the Krypton Companion and a second edition of Captain Action. And I was very active as a volunteer with my church. I was on the church choir. I was the Rotary Club, the Hearing Loss Association of America. I was the state president. I was having heart palpitations. I was, I thought I was going to die. I mean, I literally was like sleeping 4 hours a night. I was a 50-something overachiever and just going, and literally was burning myself. To a frenzy. I was burning out. And I had to let some stuff go, and I slowly but surely cut off a few things. And that's why I'm a little reluctant to go back to a question you had earlier, do another book, because I can get swept into this stuff, and I just, I still have tons of energy, but the battery isn't quite as boundless with the energy as it was. Even when I was in my 50s, I get tired early, and I go to sleep early.
I'm there now. I'm 53, so it's like...
it's gonna be, every year it's going to be a little different,
And I know I'm working on a Mad Magazine book, and it's like, no, I'm not going to get this done in a year. It's going to take 2, 3, 4 years, 5, 10, if it has to. I just can't do it that fast anymore.
Well, Mark, you're smart to understand that.
Yeah.
Because it would be better for you and better for the project if you have control of its deadline rather than its deadline having control of you.
Yeah.
And you also are fortunate and again good enough at this. You've done enough of this where you are able to take that time to deliver the project that you want to, rather than have to have it out to meet a slot and a publishing window where you have to produce it maybe faster than is best for your health.
And I've been there too, but yeah.
Best for the project. Yeah. So, more power to you. Yeah.
I guess on your dream book, maybe you could kind of introduce it like as serialized chapters in Retrofan or Back Issue or something like that, just, to kind of get it started, and then when you get enough together, oh, I got a book. It's like...
Well, I think the thing that I would need to do for that is, the relevance book is to... I will have to have a couple of conversations, some nice interviews with a few people who were sort of the movers and shakers of this type of material. And obviously Denny O'Neil is going to be one of them.
Right.
Because Green Lantern, Green Arrow in particular. I think Neil Adams, because he brought a lot to the table with that. And Mike Friedrich was also somebody who was writing Justice League. Now Stan Lee's gone. I can't talk to him about this. Roy Thomas, I can talk to him. Roy, when he was writing Avengers, just very subtly started to... he brought Black Panther into the Avengers roster, and even had Black Panther unmasked on the cover of like a late 60s issue of Avengers. I cannot quote the issue number for you now, but it was a John Buscema drawn cover, and that was sort of influential at the time because Black Panther's very first appearances in Fantastic Four, he was still fully masked,
right?
Even though it was an historical moment to introduce a black character into comics in the mid-'60s when Black Panther came along. It wasn't touted on the cover. It just said introducing the Black Panther. It didn't have a blurb saying, comics first black superhero, as they would have done as they did in the 70s, by the time Luke Cage wrote Rome, we'd already had Shaft at that point,
right.
first as a novel, then as a successful movie. So then they were able to actually, and then safely, trade on the ethnicity of the character. There was still a lot of backlash then. I know Marvel in particular in the early 70s was really doing their best to be inclusive, but they still had to fight against this distribution network that, especially here in the South where I live, they were prejudiced. They some books, even in the history of comics, as you very well know, like all Negro comics, other books out there that were published for a primarily black audience, kind of got squashed, and were short-lived because the distribution network would not allow them to get the type of distribution they needed to really find their audience. So, this racism has had its, hooks into this business in different ways that you wouldn't even think about, even though the creators were really trying to move it forward. You can create all the comics you want, but if they're not getting out there in the hands of the readers, then it's difficult. But so to me, I'm passionate about the social relevance era because that's when we literally had a transformation of the ethnicity of the comic book superheroes, and the social issues really started to allow comics characters to grow.
Right.
And they started to deal with poverty and racism and the plight of the Native Americans, and these subjects. These were like Superman and Thor. All that. I mean, even all these characters that normally would have just fought mythic or alien creatures were kind of rolling up their sleeves and getting their hands dirty in the real world.
Although I admit they did some embarrassing things back then, where they did things like in Lois Lane, I Am Curious Black and stuff like that.
Oh, man. Yeah, you can't. You can't. I mean, and that was Bob Kanigher who wrote that. And not only was that just kind of, I mean, it was like one of these things where, okay, this is obviously a middle-aged white guy who is really trying to be with it, and he comes up with this thing. But then the thing that just kind of adds insult to injury is he's. I know, poor guy. God bless you, Bob Kanigher, if you're hearing me from the great beyond, because I know you were trying to do something. But even taking the title, I Am Curious Black. Okay, well that, as you I'm sure are aware, is a play on a title of a movie, but it was softcore porn.
Right.
It was I Am Curious Yellow. It was like a nudie movie, and in 1970, when an R-rated movie, or maybe I don't know, it was R or was it X?
I don't know.
Back then, I'm not sure. But still, it was a movie that the kids reading Lois Lane could not go and see, and it's like a couple of shades of wrong. My all-time favorite comics writer was Bob Haney, The Brave and the Bold and Teen Titans, and he wrote a lot of these stories back then, but he also was the kind of guy who was sort of like your grandpa, who was thinking he was cool, but he quite wasn't. But I love his stuff, though. Nobody could tell a story and make a plot like him.
Well, actually, I'll just say this as an aside, because we're talking about social conscious, is one of my favorite articles doing for you in Back Issue is when I interviewed Bertram Fitzgerald, who recently passed away a couple years ago, for Golden Legacy, and he did Fast Willie Jackson later, we'll say that, but Golden Legacy is what he's most proud of, and it went for 16 issues, and he covered from Martin Luther King to the author of Three Musketeers, I can't think, Dumas, is that his name? And, just all the people that he covered, and he was very proud of that book. But you're talking about distribution. He had troubles, and, it was Coca-Cola that actually came to the rescue on that, so... But,
well, he was definitely someone, before his time with that as well. I mean, he essentially, what I mean by that was he was not just the fact that he was creating comic books that explored the lives of influential African Americans, but he was looking at other ways to sell the comic. Now, as you're saying, that was partially in response to the woes of distribution, but I seem to remember he was also relying upon like mail order and such. I mean, he was looking at ways to try to get his comics into the hands of readers.
Right.
And you have to give him props for that too. And I can understand that would be something he'd be very proud of, and he had every right to be proud of that too. Mm-hmm. And Fast Willie Jackson too was pretty cool comic as well. That was just kind of fun,
his version of Archie, if no one's aware of it. But anyway, I don't have any real other questions. I was just kind of curious. Just a couple of sides, just because we were talking about different things. When you were watching it on TV with Adam West, and then it suddenly switched to like the more realistic, like Neil Adams versions and stuff like that. Was that jarring to you, or were you getting older? So my Batman should grow up and become a little more mature and less silly. Or what was your take on that around that time?
Well, the second part of your question, it was that indeed, because Batman kind of grew up with me.
Yeah.
And being my age too, I've actually witnessed that through as I matured. And a lot of my contemporaries, are a lot of guys who have been the movers and shakers of comic book continuity over the past several decades are still, roughly my age. Some a little younger, some a little older, but nonetheless, we're, late baby boomers and early Gen Xers. Mm-hmm. And to me, then, that's kind of a double-edged sword to have the comics world mature with you, because when that happens, I mean, for every one of the most profound things that I think we ever published in Back Issue was back in issue number 79, looked at the Charlton action heroes in the Bronze Age, and it concluded with Dan Johnson's interview with Dave Gibbons about Watchmen. And Dave Gibbons, bless his heart, as we say here in the South, was almost apologetic for Watchmen. Not being ashamed of it, of course. No, of course not. It's one of the most influential, comic book pieces ever. But he was kind of apologetic for the fact that so many people started to copy it, and that what he and Alan Moore had co-created as a darker dystopian look at this postmodern take on superheroes sort of over time became the norm as it became more and more copied. So what I've seen with this maturation of the comic book world is, yes, Gwen Stacy died. I mean, that was one of the first big shocks I got as a reader, and I was in my early teens at that point when that was happening. And a lot of people say that was really the end of the Silver Age, even though we were several years into the Bronze Age when Jerry Conway killed Gwen Stacy in Amazing Spider-Man. But at that point, though, you just sort of realize that, okay, things can happen to these characters, and it might not be status quo next issue. And so, the readers, over time, though, when you had more and more real world infiltrate the fantasy world of comics, what has happened, I think, is just strayed farther and farther away from being an entertainment medium for kids. And now it's rare you have a child know what a comic book is. However, conversely, we've got families dressing up as the Incredibles or as, Batman, Catwoman, Batgirl, and Harley Quinn, and Robin. It's the culture has never been more aware of the characters, but the comic books themselves have really just kind of been relegated to being a seed medium for the larger popular culture.
Right.
And if that's what's keeping it alive, then, I'm glad something's keeping it alive.
Yeah. I think book-wise, the shift is over to the graphic novels, though. More like The Smile and the Geronimo Stilton or whatever it's called. Things like that, And,
But then again, that shift, though, has shifted the readership toward the 20 to 30-something or older instead of the kids. I mean, it's just... And I'm really the eternal optimist, but in this regard, I just don't think we're going to go back to a time when kids are going to say, I want to read a comic book again.
Right.
I just think that day has come and gone. However, the characters will live on, and comics type storytelling will continue, but it might be in a medium that will be morphing even, in the rest of my life and your life. And we're witnessing it now. And so I'm just glad that we still have these characters around. And I hope that Underdog's going to get a chance to get, well, they had that movie a couple of years ago, but, answer me this. You're a big animation historian and fan, but does every single kids and animated movie have to be computer generated today? Can't we have somebody draw something the good old fashioned way?
Well, I've said this for years. I may not have said it to you or in the Back Issue or anything. I think it was a secret plot by Disney to destroy everybody else's characters by making live action versions. They did a live-action Popeye originally, and then later on they did a live-action Mr. Magoo, a live-action Underdog, a live-action Inspector Gadget, a live-action Super Mario Brothers. It's just the secret plot. Because you notice there's no live-action Mickey Mouse. So it's like...
I've never thought of that, but you might be right. Might be right.
So that's my theory about it all. I don't know, but I would love to see Underdog fully flat it could be 3D animated, but I think flat animation underdog movie, and one that's better than like the Rocky and Bullwinkle movie they made about 10, 20 years ago. It was animated well, but the story was kind of, something like that.
Well,
and
the classic Disney, I mean, the true classics that used to get trotted out, every 8 years on home video for a new issuance, but they. Snow White.
Yeah, now they're doing it to their own movies. Yeah, but it's not Mickey Mouse. But it is, all the theatrical feature films they did. Now they're doing live action versions, which is really bizarre.
But that old animation still held up. It wasn't. I love Hanna-Barbera. I grew up on Hanna-Barbera cartoons, and yes, I do know that when you looked at the Flintstones cave from the outside, it looked pretty small, but inside it was cavernous because when Dino was chasing Fred, they would pass 80 windows and 80 chairs, but next to that window, they all look the same. It was in this loop, the Hanna-Barbera living room loop. But come on, the animation was extremely limited. But the animation was, and maybe the imagination was, since they were all kind of parodies of other shows. But still, I love that stuff, and the characters were just all the Hanna-Barbera stuff of the '60s just had some primitive coolness to it.
Well, earlier you mentioned that Ralph Bakshi, Mighty Mouse. You've seen the one where he gets trapped in a Hanna-Barbera type TV show, and he's running past the same, Mighty Mouse is running past the same table with a plant on it, and then he looks down three-dimensionally and he sees like this whole row of just the same table and plant on it going that he's passed 30 times already in the background. It's just kind of...
But that's classic, and now for us, as lifelong fans and historians, that's part of the lore. The LORE. And the lure. The lore and the lure. Boy, I'm glad nobody ever had that as a title. The Brave and the Bold is easy to say, but the lore and the lure, I don't know. That's not when you go ask for the comic shop after you stop by the pub first. So, I got a copy of the lore and the lure, please. But,
that's another Spider-Ham title. No.
Well, if I ever get a chance to write a Spider-Ham again, I will name this story The Lore and the Lure. It works better in print than it does verbally.
And you can have Pun Fisher in it there. All right. Well, I've enjoyed talking to you. Is there anything you'd like to plug, or how people can get a hold of you, or what's coming up in the next couple issues of Back Issue and Retrofan?
Well, let's see. The most immediate issues, I mentioned the Guardians of the Galaxy, issue 119 in March for Back Issue, and it looks like the issue that was shipping in March for Retrofan, issue 8, is now coming out in late February instead, and some people are actually already getting their copies. And it has the cow stills on the cover, and it's got Electra Woman and Dyna Girl, the Flintstones, June Lockhart, Mad Magazine in the 70s, Mars Attacks. That's just wonderful. It's a really cool issue. And so those are the next immediate issues. But after that, Retrofan 9 has Reb Brown, the 70s TV Captain America, in it, and also an interview with William Daniels, the former president of the Screen Actors Guild, who played Captain Nice in that Buck Henry superhero spoof TV show. He and his wife Bonnie Bartlett are interviewed, and they are a delight. It's literally like you're kind of sitting in the living room with your grandma and grandpa who have Emmys, and he talks about Captain Nice, which, this is a man who was the singing John Adams on Broadway and in film in 1776. He was the voice of Kit in Knight Rider. Yeah, but he's done a number of things that are out there, like Captain Nice, but he never, at least in many years, has not been interviewed about it. I don't know. I think people have kind of been scared to go to him, the guy who starred in St. Elsewhere and Boy Meets World, and ask him about, you remember the superhero thing you used to be in, at the beginning of your career? But Dan Hagen did. He wrote this piece, and he wrote a piece on Captain Nice for Retrofan 9, and interviewed Bill Daniels, and had the added bonus of his wife Bonnie Bartlett being there.
Cool.
And they end the interview by saying, "We need to go to the post office." And it's like such a couple thing, Okay, well, bye. And nice talking to you. Here we go. You just kind of imagine them getting in their car and going to the post office together, and maybe stopping at the grocery store to pick up some milk or something on the way home. But it was just so down to earth. I loved it. But they still told some great stories about the TV shows and about being on wires and flying and stuff. And so it was. Yeah, it was fun. So, and then after that, issue 120 of Back Issue is Heroes of Tomorrow, which has a great Steve Lytle, Mon-El, and the Legion of Superheroes cover, and a lot of stuff about heroes from the future, from Marvel's Paradox to DC's Manhunter 2070, as well as the Legion and a lot of other fun stuff. So I'm going to keep producing these magazines, and occasionally a book, as long as there are wonderful people out there who want to read this stuff. And I'm just happy to have an audience, and happy that you're interested enough to want to talk to me today. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And how do they get a hold of you, or what websites or anything you want to plug?
Well, tomorrow's www.twomorros.com. WS. Whoops, I spelled that wrong. Tomorrows. That's embarrassing for the editor/writer to misspell. Good thing this isn't a spelling bee. You're out of here. Tomorrows.com or retrofan.org. Both Retrofan and Back Issue have active Facebook pages, and we always are welcoming people to come and join the fun with those groups. However, there is a bit of a disclaimer, editorial disclaimer, that the tones of the magazines are positive, and the tones of the Facebook pages are as well. And the Back Issue in particular, we have over 10,000 members in that group. It's very vibrant and active, but it takes some policing. And John Trumbull, who is an occasional contributor to Back Issue, is the chief administrator with me, kind of as a deputy of the Facebook page. And every now and then people just get a little out of control. Not often, but we just, come on, there's enough snark out there. And also some of the creators who created Bronze Age comics are members of our group, and so every now and then somebody will write something insulting there, and they're on that page. And so, no, I just ask anybody to, if you're going to make a post, you have the right to, be critical of the work, but don't be hypercritical and mean.
Right.
Just remember that.
Downright crass and rude.
Exactly, and some people can be that way, and that's rare. And most of the people who are on the Back Issue group are fine and understand that. But I like for the Back Issue, the Facebook pages to mirror the tones of the magazine. And however, that's a little tougher to do when you've got 10,000 voices chiming in. But overall, it's a lot of fun, and people get to swap stories about the past. And every now and then you'll get somebody like Steve Lytle or Dan DiDio or someone chime in too with their recollection. So wow, how cool is that? No other medium really gives fans that level of immediacy and intimacy to the creative base that comics does. So, we're fortunate to have that.
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Michael Eury, for being my special podcast guest today. And
thank you, Mark Arnold, for inviting me. I really had a good time. Hope I didn't talk your ear off.
That's fine. Okay, thank you very much, and looking forward to many, many years more of Retrofan and Back Issue.
Thank you. So am I. And thanks again for your time.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Michael Eury, for being my special guest. Episode number 67 will be coming soon. If you would like to comment and or be a guest on this podcast, please drop me a line at funideas.mark@gmail.com. Become a patron of Mark Arnold and Fun Ideas Productions. If everyone listening just contributed $1 a month, that would be a tremendous help in continuing the production of my books and this podcast. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel. The opening and closing music for the Fun Ideas podcast is provided courtesy of Andrew the Slow Poisoner Goldfarb and is used with permission. This has been the Fun Ideas podcast. This is Mark Arnold speaking. This episode is copyright 2020, Fun Ideas Productions. Thank you, and good night.
Pills in the pink electric church.